I took care of my grandfather on my own for 3 years, with no help from my parents. He left me $3 million to become a decent man. Now my lovely parents forged papers and sued me. I don't even know where to start. I've been sitting here, staring at my computer for what feels like hours, wondering if it's even worth writing all this down. It's a long story, so buckle up if you decide to stick with me. Growing up, I always felt like I didn't belong in my own family. I'm not sure exactly when I started noticing the cracks, but it was early. I remember being 6 or 7, sitting at the dinner table, feeling like I was an inconvenience to my parents. They weren't abusive, not physically at least, but it was clear I wasn't what they wanted. Every time I messed up, every little mistake, they piled on the disappointment like I was born just to ruin their perfect life plan. My dad, James, was a successful lawyer, and to him, appearances were everything. He was the type of guy who measured his worth by his bank account, the car in his driveway. You know the type: tailored suits, slicked back hair, everything polished to perfection on the outside, but hollow on the inside. He barely ever acknowledged me unless it was to criticize me for not being more like him. "Why can't you be more like your cousin Lucas?" he'd say. "If you don't start pulling your weight, you'll end up flipping burgers." Classic. And then there was my mom, Charlotte. She wasn't any better. Her thing was passive-aggressive comments, always reminding me that I'd never live up to the perfect life she had envisioned. She wanted a kid she could show off, a little accessory for her country club gatherings. Instead, she got me quiet, awkward, and totally out of place. Her version of love was cold, conditional, and suffocating. She'd give me gifts and then remind me later how much they cost, expecting gratitude in return like some kind of emotional transaction. But then, there was Grandpa Henry. He was my dad's father and, honestly, the only person who ever made me feel truly seen. Grandpa Henry was quiet, but there was something so calming about him. He wasn't flashy or rich like my dad, but he had this wisdom that came from living through hard times. He knew how to appreciate the small things. Whenever I felt crushed under the weight of my parents' criticism, I'd run to him. He lived a couple of towns over, so I didn't get to see him as often as I'd have liked, but when I did, it felt like I could finally breathe again. He taught me so much. How to. Grandpa Henry was the one who kept me sane. He taught me how to build things with my hands, how to think for myself, and how to have patience when the world felt like it was falling apart. He didn't have much formal education, but his wisdom was undeniable. He saw life as a series of lessons, where every challenge was another opportunity to grow. Whenever my parents tore me down, he was the one who put me back together. School. That was a nightmare, too. But, really, given everything else, that's no surprise. I was the awkward, skinny kid with no confidence, and fewer friends than I could count. I tried to fit in. God, I tried, but I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. Kids are cruel. When they smell weakness, they pounce. So I kept my head down, avoided drawing attention to myself. It was easier that way, at least until high school. I thought high school would be different. I thought maybe I'd finally find my place. Maybe things would get better. But nope, more of the same. I was invisible to everyone, except when someone wanted to make me the butt of their joke. At home, things had only gotten worse. My parents had given up on me. They stopped trying to force me into their idea of perfection and just tolerated me. That was the extent of it. I spent most of my time at Grandpa's house, escaping as much as I could from the suffocating atmosphere at home. Then, out of nowhere, something changed. I don't know if it was just luck or the universe finally giving me a break, but I got into college. Not just any college, a really good one. My grades weren't stellar, but I had this ability to write, and I think it was that essay that did it. For the first time in my life, I felt like there was a chance. Like maybe, just maybe, things were going to change. College was my escape. I packed my bags with this electric excitement, like I was finally breaking free from the chains that had held me down for so long. I thought once I left, things would be better. I'd be on my own. I'd be creating a life, my life, away from all the toxicity. But the reality hit me hard. Once I got to school, I realized how unprepared I really was. Yeah, I was free from my parents, but I had no clue how to navigate the real world. I was completely unprepared. The first year, it was a blur. Anxiety, loneliness, and the crushing weight of needing to succeed. I thought getting into college would be the hardest part, but staying afloat? That was a whole different battle. I barely scraped by with my grades. Socially, forget it. I wasn't the life of the party. Hell, I wasn't even in the same room as the party. During that time, I barely spoke to my parents. My mom would shoot me an occasional text, usually about my grades or some family event I had to go to. And my dad? Silent. Always silent. The only person who ever really checked in on me was Grandpa Henry. He called me every single week, without fail. Always asking if I was okay. Always reminding me that I was stronger than I thought, that things would get better. His voice, his words, they were a lifeline for me. But everything changed right before my second year of college started. I got a call from my dad. And right from the start, I could feel something was wrong. When I picked up, his voice was quieter than usual. So quiet that I knew, even before he said anything, that my world was about to come crashing down. He told me Grandpa Henry had died. I swear, for a second, I couldn't breathe. It didn't make sense. Grandpa had been fine. The last time we spoke, he was full of life, full of wisdom, the one constant in my life. He was supposed to be untouchable. But now, he was gone. Just like that. And my dad. His voice was so cold. Empty. Like he was reading me some boring news headline instead of giving me the worst news of my life. It's time to grow up, he said, as if it was some damn lesson. You don't need to be coddled anymore. I felt like the ground beneath me had been ripped away. My parents had stripped me of everything over the years. My confidence, my sense of who I was. But Grandpa was the one thing, the one person, who'd always been there. And now even he was gone. After the funeral, I couldn't go back to school. I tried, I really did. But my mind wouldn't let me. I couldn't focus on anything except the fact that the one person who ever truly saw me, who actually loved me, was gone. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I packed up everything I could fit in my car and left. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not the few friends I had left. I didn't say goodbye. I just left. I drove. I used the money I had saved from working part-time jobs to get as far away as I could. I ended up in a small town, a few hours away from where Grandpa had lived. I rented a cheap apartment, took any job I could find. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally in control. I wasn't answering to anyone. I wasn't being told who to be, what to do. For the first time in years, I was free. But here's the twist. I'm not sure I made the right choice. It's been months, and while I don't miss my parents, I miss him. I miss Grandpa. I miss the way he made me feel like I wasn't alone in this godforsaken world. Without him, I'm left to try to figure everything out on my own, and it feels like I'm failing. So yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm not looking for advice. I don't even know what anyone could say to fix this. I just had to get it out, to scream into the void. Maybe when I see it written down, maybe it will finally start to make sense. Maybe then I'll figure out what to do next. After I ran away from everything, school, my parents, the suffocating life they had planned for me, I found myself back at the one place that ever felt like home, Grandpa's house. Driving up to it after being gone for months felt strange. The memories hit me all at once. It was like stepping into a time capsule, but this time, without the one person who had always made it feel warm and safe. The house itself was simple, nothing fancy, sitting on a decent-sized plot of land. Grandpa Henry had never been about impressing anyone, the total opposite of my parents. He lived simply. That's how I always saw him, a simple man with simple needs. But I was wrong about him. When I got there, the house felt different. Colder. I half expected Grandpa to round the corner, his familiar half-smile on his face, ready to share some piece of old wisdom. But of course, he didn't. The weight of his absence hit me harder than I had anticipated. I had been running from the pain of his death, but being back in his space made it impossible to keep avoiding it. I wasn't sure how long I could stay. I didn't have anywhere else to go. A few days after I settled in, I got a call from a lawyer. At first, I didn't answer it. I assumed it was just another creditor or something. But then they left a message, and I knew it was important. Grandpa had left a will, and the lawyer said I needed to come in. I wasn't expecting much. Maybe Grandpa had left me some of his old tools, his beat-up truck, things that meant the world to him but wouldn't matter to anyone else. I showed up at the lawyer's office, thinking I'd just be signing some papers and moving on with my life. But when I sat down, I realized I had no idea what was coming. The lawyer, this straight-laced guy named Michael, I couldn't help but notice the irony that he shared my dad's name, handed me a folder and started explaining things in that dry, formal legal tone that makes everything sound even more distant than it is. Apparently, Grandpa had been planning for this for years. He had signed over the house to me, which, okay, I could have guessed. But that wasn't all. Grandpa had left me everything. And by everything, I mean everything. Grandpa, the man who lived like he didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, had been quietly saving for his entire life. Michael pulled out documents showing bank accounts, investments, assets, totaling over $2 million. I nearly fell out of my chair. This man, the man who had never talked about money, who never flaunted anything, who always lived paycheck to paycheck, had been quietly building a fortune, just for me. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Grandpa had been sitting on a small fortune, and I was completely blind to it. I felt like I had stepped into some alternate universe where nothing made sense. My mind raced as I asked the lawyer if there had been a mistake. But he assured me it was all legitimate. Grandpa had been methodically saving and investing his entire life. Preparing for something, maybe for me. He never talked about money. To him, it wasn't about wealth, it was about security. He'd saved for a rainy day, as the lawyer said. And now that rainy day was here. I was the one who inherited it. But the real shock was still coming. As I read through the rest of Grandpa's will, it became clear this wasn't just about money. It was about trust. In the letter attached to the will, Grandpa wrote to me, telling me that, no matter what, he'd always believed in me, even when no one else did. He said he'd saved the money because he knew I'd need it one day. Not just to survive, but to build something. To build my life. Not one dictated by anyone else. Not by my parents. By him. I sat there in that cold office, staring at the letter in shock, unable to move. It felt like everything he'd done for me, everything, was in that letter. He knew. He knew how hard life had been for me, how suffocating it had been, how trapped I felt. And in his quiet, humble way, he'd left me the keys to break free. It was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders and crushed me at the same time. After the shock wore off, I started thinking about what to do with the money. The first thing I did was move into Grandpa's house. Permanently. It was the only place that had ever felt like home, and now, it felt like it was where I was supposed to be. I quit the odd jobs I'd been scraping by with and took a breath. I took the time to think. I was finally free to make my own choices. For the first time in my life, I had a future that was mine. And it didn't take long to decide. Grandpa had taught me everything I knew about hard work, about how to build something from the ground up. He had given me the tools to succeed, and I was going to honor that. I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. So I took a leap. I invested a portion of the money into opening my own restaurant. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. A restaurant? Really? It wasn't some revolutionary idea, but it had always been my dream. I loved cooking, but more than that, I wanted to create a space where people felt like they belonged. Just like I did with Grandpa. I didn't need anything fancy. I just wanted a small, cozy place where people could come, eat good food, and feel at home. I found an old building in town, run down but full of character. I poured myself into it, renovating it with the skills Grandpa had taught me. I hired locals to help with the heavy lifting, and little by little, the place started to come together. I called it Henry's. After Grandpa. Because this was all because of him. Opening night. It was a dream. It was surreal. The whole town showed up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just existing. I was living. I was doing something that mattered. And I felt, for the first time in forever, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The opening night was everything I had dreamed of, and more. The place was packed, and I couldn't believe how many people had shown up. I didn't even know that many lived around here, but they flooded in, curious, excited, and hungry for something new. The feedback was incredible. They loved the food, the atmosphere, the whole vibe. I felt like I had pulled off a miracle. But even as things seemed to be falling into place, I could feel the cracks starting to form beneath the surface. Running a business is a monster. It takes everything out of you, and it doesn't care if you're ready. The restaurant was booming, but it came with a price. Long hours, constant stress, dealing with supply chain nightmares, disgruntled staff, and the never-ending pressure to keep everything afloat. One of the worst problems came from a guy I didn't expect much from at first, Tony, the owner of a high-end restaurant across town. He didn't like competition, and he didn't like me. At first, I thought he'd just talk a big game, but Tony wasn't going to let it slide. He started showing up at my place, making snide comments about how it was all temporary, how people would get bored of it. I tried to ignore him, to let it roll off my back, but then it escalated. One night, after closing, I walked into the restaurant and saw it, smashed to pieces. Everything was broken. Tables, chairs, dishes, glass. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear, it was a message. I didn't have proof it was Tony, but I knew. It was his way of trying to push me out, to break me. I felt the rage building inside me, but I refused to back down. I had poured everything into this place. My time, my energy, Grandpa's money. I wasn't going to let some petty, jealous asshole destroy what I had worked for. I doubled down. Hired security, locked the place up tighter than Fort Knox every night. The vandalism stopped, but the pressure didn't. The stress. It was suffocating. Running the restaurant took everything from me. There were days I couldn't even breathe. I woke up at dawn to prep, stayed until after midnight to close up, and in between, I was putting out fire after fire, sometimes literally. And I couldn't let up. Not once. But then, something incredible happened. The restaurant didn't just survive. It thrived. Word spread like wildfire, and suddenly, we had regulars coming in from the city, people who had heard about this little hidden gem in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just a local spot anymore, it was becoming a destination. With success came more pressure. More money meant more problems. It was like the universe was testing me at every turn. Suddenly, people I hadn't seen in years were coming back into my life. Family, old friends, even my parents. And just like that, I wasn't the disappointment anymore. My parents, who had all but written me off, now saw me differently. They heard about the restaurant's success, and suddenly, I wasn't a failure. I wasn't invisible anymore. They wanted in. They wanted a piece of my success. They wanted something from me, just like they always had, but now it was wrapped in a pretty bow. And that felt like a kick in the gut. She called, pretending like she cared. Acting all sweet, asking how things were going, throwing out subtle hints that she and my dad should come visit. It made my skin crawl. After everything they'd put me through, years of neglect, making me feel like I was nothing, like I didn't matter, now they wanted to hitch a ride on my success? No. I shut it down without hesitation. I told them I didn't need them. I had built this life on my own, without them, and they were not welcome in it. That moment, it was everything. It felt like breaking free from a lifetime of chains. The freedom was raw, exhilarating. As time went on, I expanded the restaurant. I turned it into a small franchise, opening 2 more locations in nearby towns. I wasn't just getting by, I was crushing it. The money was flowing in, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had control. I didn't need anyone else's approval. I didn't need to prove myself to my parents, or anyone else. I had built something that mattered. Something real. But even with all that success, there was this black hole inside me. I missed Grandpa more than I could put into words. I would have traded every dollar, every bit of success, just for one more conversation with him. To hear his voice. To get that calming, steady advice. He had always known what to say, how to make the chaos feel like it would be okay, even when it wasn't. I thought money would fill that emptiness. I thought success would do it. But it didn't. It was nice, sure. But it wasn't the answer. What I realized was that the real gift Grandpa gave me wasn't the money, the house, or the restaurant. It was the belief in myself. He had seen something in me that no one else had, and he gave me the tools to make it real. To build it. So here I am now, writing this post from the office of my latest restaurant, reflecting on everything. Life has been a whirlwind. Full of twists, turns, and punches to the gut I never saw coming. But through it all, I've learned one thing. The hardest lessons often come from the least expected places. And the people who leave the biggest marks on you are often the ones who leave the most. It's been a while since I posted last, and honestly, I wish I didn't have to write this. I thought the worst was over. I thought that once I built my life, once I had everything in place, I'd be done with the people who tried to break me. But I was wrong. Turns out, the past doesn't stay buried. Not when it involves people like my parents. So, here it is. After years of silence, my parents showed up, out of the blue. They had been watching my success from a distance, just waiting for the right moment to worm their way back in. They saw I was doing well, and suddenly, I wasn't such a disappointment anymore. I wasn't the screw-up. They decided it was time to cozy up, to play the family card. And I shut it down immediately. I told them it was too late. I didn't need them, not after all the years of abandonment. But I thought that would be the end of it. I thought once they saw I wasn't interested, they'd back off. I was wrong. A few months after I expanded the restaurant and things started really taking off, my parents pushed again. They came at me harder this time, using every emotional weapon in their arsenal. And for a second, I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep the walls up. It was a slow weekday afternoon when I saw them walk through the door of Henry's. The moment I laid eyes on them, my stomach dropped. I had no idea how they found me, but there they were. My mom wore that fake, overly sweet smile, the one I'd seen so many times as a kid when she wanted something. And my dad, as cold and calculated as ever. They walked straight up to me, like nothing had ever happened, like they hadn't abandoned me for years, like they hadn't treated me like I was less than nothing. "Ethan," my mom said, her voice dripping with that same tone she used when she wanted to manipulate me, "we've missed you. We need to talk." I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring, my brain struggling to process the fact that they had the audacity to come into my restaurant, after everything. After everything they'd done. The last time I saw them, I made it perfectly clear, I wanted nothing to do with them. "I have nothing to say to you," I finally muttered, my voice as cold as ice. But of course, they weren't just here to talk. My mom's expression hardened, and my dad stepped forward, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "This isn't a social visit," he said, his voice dripping with that same condescension I'd heard my entire life. "We're here because of Grandpa Henry's estate." My heart stopped. I blinked, not understanding at first. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice wavering. "You're not the rightful heir," my dad continued, his voice sharp, cold, like he was delivering bad news to a stranger. "We've been speaking with our lawyer, and we've decided to contest the will. Legally, that money belongs to us." It was like I'd been punched in the gut. Contest the will. Grandpa had made it crystal clear that everything went to me. There was no question. No ambiguity. I was the heir. Or so I thought. Before I could respond, my mom spoke up, her voice cutting through the air. "Your grandfather didn't know what he was doing," she sneered. "He wasn't in his right mind when he made those decisions. He was sick, confused. We're his children, Ethan. We're the ones who should have inherited everything." And just like that, it hit me. They weren't here to just push my buttons. They weren't here to just get under my skin. They were actually planning to take this to court, to sue me. They wanted everything Grandpa left me. The house. The money. The business I had built from the ground up. They wanted it all. I couldn't even find words. It was like my world was crumbling all over again. Just when I thought I had finally escaped them. Just when I thought I had broken free, they were back, and they were ready to destroy everything I had worked for. Everything Grandpa had trusted me with. "Good luck with that," I finally spat, trying to keep my voice steady, though my insides were shaking. "You'll lose." My dad just smirked. It was the same smirk he wore every time he thought he had the upper hand. "We'll see about that," he said, and with that, they turned and walked out. I stood there, frozen for a long moment, the weight of their words settling in. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. They were back. And they weren't going to stop until they took it all. For days, I couldn't wrap my head around what had just happened. They were going to try to take everything from me. Everything Grandpa had left me. All of it, because he believed in me, because he knew I was the only one who would use it to build something real. Something worthwhile. The weight of that hit me like a freight train. The next few weeks were a blur. Endless legal meetings, sleepless nights, the gnawing anxiety that I was fighting something I didn't even know how to beat. I had to hire a lawyer, someone who specialized in estate law. That's when I met Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in court. She was exactly what I needed. When I explained the situation to her, she immediately took charge, her confidence washing over me. "We have a solid case," she said, her voice steady, assuring me I wasn't fighting this alone. "The will is clear. Your grandfather left everything to you. There's no way they can prove otherwise unless they have evidence suggesting he was incompetent when he signed it." I nodded, feeling a slight sense of relief. But even then, something inside me wouldn't let go. I couldn't shake the feeling that my parents were up to something. They wouldn't go through all this trouble unless they thought they had a shot at winning. And I was right. A few weeks before the trial, we got word that my parents had somehow dug up medical records showing that Grandpa had been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment in the months leading up to his death. They were using it as their evidence, trying to claim that he wasn't in his right mind when he wrote the will. I couldn't believe it. They were trying to paint Grandpa as senile, as if he didn't know what he was doing. It was disgusting. Grandpa had been perfectly capable of making his own decisions right until the day he passed, but now they were using his age and his medical history against him, all to get their hands on the money. It made my blood boil. But Sarah wasn't fazed. She looked at me, calm and assured. "We can fight this," she said confidently. "Medical records are one thing, but we have plenty of witnesses who can attest to your grandfather's mental clarity. His friends, his doctor, even the lawyer who drafted the will. Still, the thought of going to court, of having to defend myself, to defend Grandpa's legacy, it was overwhelming. I wasn't just fighting for the money. I was fighting for the one thing in my life that had ever truly been mine. The one thing that was real." The trial dragged on for months. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every day was an emotional battle I wasn't sure I could win. My parents pulled every dirty trick they could think of. Their lawyer, some slick, high-powered guy named Kevin, who probably made more in a day than I made in a week, was relentless. He grilled me on the stand, trying to tear me apart. "You were very close to your grandfather, weren't you?" Kevin asked, his voice oozing with false sympathy. He paced in front of the jury, playing the part of the concerned attorney, while all I could think about was how he was trying to tear apart everything I had left. "You spent a lot of time with him. Even more than his own children." Kevin's voice dripped with insinuation as he paced in front of the jury, trying to twist every word. I nodded, my jaw clenched. Yes, he was the only one who ever cared about me. "And isn't it true," Kevin continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that you encouraged him to write the will in your favor? That you might have influenced his decision while he was in a vulnerable state?" I felt the rage boiling inside me, my fists clenched under the table as I fought to keep my composure. "No," I said, my voice low but firm. "Grandpa made his own decisions. He knew exactly what he was doing." But they didn't stop there. My parents brought in witnesses, old family friends who testified that Grandpa had been forgetful in his final months, that he'd become confused about simple things. It was all lies, twisted half-truths, designed to paint him as incapable of making rational decisions. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. The worst part was seeing my parents up on the stand, lying through their teeth about how much they'd cared for Grandpa. My mom put on this act, tears in her eyes, her voice trembling as she talked about how devastated she was by his passing, how much she missed him. It made me sick. Every word felt like a knife in my gut. But through it all, Sarah stayed calm, coldly calm. She dismantled their arguments, piece by piece, finding every crack in their lies. She brought in Grandpa's doctor, who testified that, yes, Grandpa had been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, but that it had never affected his ability to make decisions. Then the lawyer, who had drafted the will, testified that Grandpa had been clear, concise, and firm when he made the decision. And then there were Grandpa's friends, old-timers who had known him for decades, who all attested to his sharpness, his mental clarity, even in his later years. It felt like we were finally winning. The tide was turning. But then, just when I thought I could breathe again, my parents pulled their trump card. I'll never forget the moment they unveiled it. It was during one of the final days of the trial. Their lawyer stood up, holding a document I'd never seen before. I felt my heart skip a beat. He claimed that this was a more recent version of Grandpa's will, the one that left everything to my parents. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the piece of paper in Kevin's hand. How the hell had they gotten that? It was dated just 2 months before Grandpa died, and it completely contradicted the original will. According to this new version, Grandpa had changed his mind, decided to leave everything to my parents, with me getting nothing. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin. It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me all over again. Sarah was furious. I could see the fire in her eyes as she stood up, demanding to see the document. She examined it quickly, then turned to me, her face hard. "This is a forgery," she said, her voice cold with fury. "A desperate, last-ditch effort to steal everything from you. But we had a problem. We had to prove it. And time was running out." The weeks leading up to the trial were some of the most stressful of my life. We brought in handwriting experts to analyze the signatures on the second will, and they proved what I had suspected all along. The signature didn't match Grandpa's usual handwriting. The ink was different. The strokes were off. Every detail pointed to it being a forgery. In the end, the jury saw through my parents' lies. The second will was thrown out, and the court upheld the original will, the one that left everything to me. Relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. I had spent months fighting against the very people who were supposed to be my family. The people who had tried to destroy me, tried to take everything I had worked so hard for. And they had almost succeeded. When the verdict came down, I felt the weight of it lift. But there was no celebration. There was no triumph in my chest. There was only the hollow echo of months spent in battle with my own blood. The betrayal had left its mark, and I wasn't sure how to move past it. After the trial, I cut all ties with them. I made it crystal clear, they were no longer welcome in my life. They had shown their true colors, and I couldn't pretend I didn't see it anymore. There was no going back. I didn't need them. I had built this life without them, and I was determined to keep it that way. The whole ordeal left me exhausted. Mentally, emotionally drained. But it also made me stronger. I had faced my worst fears, confronted the people who had tried to tear me down, and I had come out the other side still standing. Grandpa hadn't just left me money and property. He had left me the strength to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against me. As I sit here now, in the office of my restaurant, reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize that this chapter of my life is finally over. My parents are gone. They're out of my life for good. I can focus on the future. I have my business, my home, and the life Grandpa wanted for me. And for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. I thought the chaos was over. I thought the battle with my parents had been the final fight. I thought I could finally move on with my life and leave the past behind me. But just when I thought I had seen the last of my family's dysfunction, I was wrong. Because this time, the curveball came in the form of my stepbrother, Ryan. Now, Ryan wasn't someone I grew up with. My dad had remarried after my mom, and he split up years before the whole court drama. Ryan was the son from that second marriage. We weren't close. Never had been. Ryan was a couple of years older than me, and we only saw each other at those awkward family events, Thanksgivings, the occasional birthday, those obligatory moments. He had always been a hothead, quick to anger, constantly needing to prove something. I could see it in his eyes. He hated that I got any attention from our father. And I knew, even then, that things between us would never be easy. Ryan had always resented me. Deep down, I knew it. I'd heard rumors that he was having issues after our parents lost the court battle over Grandpa's estate. His temper had been flaring up more than usual, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I had no idea how much resentment had been building up inside him, festering, until one night when it all came crashing down. It was late. I had just gotten home from another grueling day at the restaurant. Business was booming, and while that should have felt like a win, it often left me feeling drained and empty. Most nights, I looked forward to coming back to Grandpa's house. My house now, because it was the one place where I could relax, where I felt safe. Or at least, I used to feel safe. That night was different. I should have known something was off the moment I walked through the front door. The air felt thick, unnatural, heavy, like there was something wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint it. I shrugged it off, too tired to think about it, and went about my usual routine. I was halfway through making a late-night snack in the kitchen when I heard a noise upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the wind or the house settling. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A sharp thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something being knocked over. My heart began to race. Someone was in the house. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and slowly made my way up the stairs, the weight of dread pressing on my chest with each step. I crept through the hallway, my breath shallow, and as I rounded the corner at the top of the stairs, I saw him. Ryan. He was standing there in the hallway, breathing heavily, his face twisted in anger. His eyes were wild, almost manic, like he was barely in control of himself. And in his hand, he was gripping a crowbar. Ryan, I managed to choke out, the words barely leaving my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. What the hell are you doing here? He didn't answer. Instead, he stormed toward me, the crowbar still clutched tightly in his fist. My body froze for a second, the fear rooting me in place, but then I backed up, instinctively trying to put some distance between us. He was quicker. Before I could react, he swung the crowbar, the heavy metal slamming into the wall next to me with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the house, and I jumped back, barely keeping my balance as I tripped over my own feet. "This is all your fault," he screamed, his voice shaking with rage. "Everything. The money, the house, Dad losing the case. It's all because of you." I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling as I spoke, but he wasn't listening. His face was red with fury, and his breath was ragged, like he couldn't contain the storm inside him. His words were incoherent, all jumbled in his head, each one more venomous than the last. I barely had a chance to take a breath before he lunged at me again, this time hitting me square in the chest with his fist. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I stumbled back, struggling to keep my balance. My vision blurred, but before I could even recover, he came at me again. The crowbar swung wildly, and I barely managed to dodge the next blow. But this time, his fist connected with the side of my face. The pain shot through me like fire. My head snapped to the side, the blow ringing in my ears, and I felt myself stumble, dizzy from the force of it. But Ryan wasn't done. He came at me again, his movements wild, fueled by rage. I could barely keep up, blocking and dodging as best I could. But his fists kept coming, faster and harder. The adrenaline surged through me, my body reacting faster than my mind could catch up. I had to keep fighting, keep surviving. "Do you think you deserve all of this?" Ryan yelled, standing over me. His face was twisted with fury, his chest heaving as he glared down at me. "You think Grandpa loved you more than me? You think you're better than me?" I couldn't believe this was happening. Ryan had always been aggressive, but this was something else. It was like he had completely snapped, and I was caught in the crossfire. I could barely think, just feeling the cold burn of fear coursing through me as I struggled to breathe. With everything I had left, I managed to get to my feet and shoved him back. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and for a second, I was fighting on pure instinct. We wrestled, each of us desperate to overpower the other, our hands gripping and pulling, trying to control the chaos. But Ryan had the advantage. He was stronger, and the crowbar was still in his hand. I knew I needed help, but my phone was downstairs, out of reach, and I wasn't sure I could make it if I tried to run. Panic clawed at me. I couldn't let him win. Then, like a light in the dark, I remembered the security cameras. After everything with my parents, I had installed them as a precaution, just in case something like this ever happened. I knew they were recording everything, and that gave me a tiny shred of hope. As Ryan raised the crowbar to strike me again, I took a desperate shot. I grabbed his wrist, twisted it, and forced him to drop the weapon. It clattered to the floor, echoing through the hallway, and in that moment of chaos, we both scrambled for it. I was quicker. I grabbed it first, and with all the strength I could muster, I threw it as far as I could down the hall. But Ryan wasn't done. With a roar, he tackled me to the floor. His fists were a blur, pounding into me as we struggled, rolling across the floor, exchanging brutal blows. Blood ran down my face from where his fist had landed, and I could taste it in my mouth, sharp and metallic, but I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him take everything from me. Not like this. Finally, I saw my chance. I kicked him hard in the stomach, sending him flying backward with a grunt. He slammed into the wall, and I used the opening to sprint down the stairs toward the front door. I heard him scrambling behind me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I grabbed my phone off the kitchen counter, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hit the buttons. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I managed to dial 911. The operator answered almost immediately, and I blurted out the words, barely able to speak through the panic. My stepbrother broke into my house. He's attacking me. Please send someone quick. The operator assured me that the police were on their way, but I knew I had to hold Ryan off until they arrived. I backed up toward the front door, my eyes glued to the stairs, waiting for him to come after me again. Sure enough, Ryan appeared at the top of the stairs, bloodied and furious. "You called the cops," he snarled. "You're gonna regret that." But this time, I wasn't scared. I had the police on the way, and more importantly, I knew I had the security footage that could prove everything, every brutal, unhinged move he'd made. Ryan stormed down the stairs, but before he could reach me, I heard the sirens in the distance. The sound of them was like a lifeline, a breath of relief that I couldn't let myself fully believe just yet. But it was close. I was almost there. It was like a switch flipped inside him the moment he heard the sirens. His eyes, once wild with rage, flickered with something else, fear. He looked around in a panic, as if the reality of what he had done was suddenly hitting him all at once. His shoulders sagged for just a second, but then he bolted. He tried to make a run for the back door, but it was too late. The police stormed in, bursting through the front door with their guns drawn. I didn't even have to say anything. Ryan didn't try to fight them. Instead, he dropped to his knees, hands in the air, his face pale and defeated. He surrendered without a word, the crowbar still clutched in his hand. As they cuffed him and dragged him outside, my legs buckled beneath me. I collapsed onto the floor, my whole body shaking violently from the adrenaline. I was shaking, gasping for air, unable to fully process what had just happened. The police questioned me for hours. My statement. The footage. They went over the security footage with a fine-tooth comb, every inch of the fight, every word, every movement. The cameras had caught everything. There was no doubt about what had happened. Ryan had broken into my house, attacked me, tried to take everything from me, just like my parents had. But this time, I had fought back, and this time, I had won. Ryan was charged with assault, breaking and entering, and a whole list of other crimes. The trial was quick. His defense didn't even have a chance to stand. There was no explaining away what he had done. He was convicted easily, sentenced to prison. And I haven't heard a word from him since. But even with all of that, even with the weight lifting from my shoulders, I didn't feel relief. I thought I would, thought I'd finally be free of the family that had torn me apart. But instead, there was only this gnawing emptiness. I had won, but at what cost? I had fought my own brother, my stepbrother, yes, but still, someone who was supposed to be family. Someone who should have had my back. And now he was in prison because of me. I tried to tell myself I had done the right thing. I had fought for my life, for what was mine. But every time I thought about it, the guilt weighed heavier on me. I threw myself into work, into the business. The restaurant was booming. The franchise was expanding. Everything was running smoothly, better than it ever had. I should have been happy. I should have felt victorious, but all I felt was this emptiness, this hole in my chest. Every time I walked into that house, I couldn't escape the memory of that night, of what I had to do to survive, of how I came so close to losing everything again, how close I came to losing myself. One night, after another grueling day at the restaurant, I collapsed into my office, my body aching. I stared at the framed photo of Grandpa Henry sitting on my desk. I picked it up slowly, running my fingers over the glass, feeling the cool edge of the frame. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I thought about what Grandpa had always told me. Life wasn't just about surviving. It was about building something that mattered. Something that would last. Something that, no matter how hard life came at me, would stand firm. And then I realized I had done exactly that. Grandpa had left me more than just money or property. He had left me the strength to build my own future, to protect it, to fight for it. And no matter what came next, I was ready. I had spent so much time fighting to hold on to what Grandpa had left me that I had completely forgotten the most important part of life, living. The battle had consumed me. I had been so focused on survival, on protecting what I had built, that I'd lost sight of the joy, the freedom, and the connections that made life worth living. So, I made a decision. I decided to take a step back from the business. I had been clinging to control so tightly, afraid that if I let go even a little, everything would fall apart. But I realized I couldn't keep doing that. I had to let go. I hired more managers, people I trusted, to keep things running smoothly, while I focused on me. I started spending time on the things that really mattered. I began volunteering at a local shelter, just like Grandpa had always encouraged me to do. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with over the years, people who had been there for me when I needed them most. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again. It wasn't easy. The scars from everything that had happened were deep, and I knew they would always be there, like permanent marks on my soul. But I was healing, bit by bit. I was learning how to live again, how to be more than just someone fighting to survive. I was starting to understand that the real strength wasn't just in holding on, but in knowing when to let go and embrace the future. As I sit here now, writing this final update, I realize that the most important thing Grandpa ever gave me wasn't the money, the house, or the restaurant. It was the strength to keep going, no matter what life threw at me. The strength to fight for what was mine, but also the wisdom to know when to step back and live my life. Life isn't perfect. It never will be. But for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that. I've learned that peace doesn't come from victory or success. It comes from living fully, even when the past still lingers, and trusting that I have the strength to keep moving forward.